Okay, so now that we've reformatted our database a little bit to incorporate our new levels of permissions that we want to allow users to assign, the next thing that we're going to do here is allow users to set those different permissions in the first place from the front end and also change those. So our basic strategy, first of all, is going to be when the user goes to the share page for a note, right? And they can get there by clicking on share when they're on one of their own notes. What we're going to have in addition to this text input here that allows them to enter in a user's email is we're going to have a radio button group. All right, and I'm just going to draw it down here, but it'll actually be above this button. We're going to have a radio button group that will allow the user to select whether that new email, right, whether the user with that email should be able to edit, right, or whether that user should be able to just view the note. So it'll be something like can view. And obviously we'll be able to add more options to this as time goes on, which will be very handy for being able to extend the permissions of our application. So what we're going to want to do here is open up the shared emails component, which is where we're currently displaying that form and stuff. So let's open up shared emails. And if we scroll down here to our share button, right above that, we're going to want to add a radio group. So here's what that's going to look like. We're going to say div. Okay, so we're going to put everything inside of a div first of all. And we're going to just have the text permission level above that. Maybe that's a little bit of a technical term, but we'll just leave it there for now. We can always change that later. And now under that text, we're going to display all of the different options for, for selecting a permission. So the first one here, we're going to say label, and there's going to be a radio input inside of here. But for the text, we're going to say can edit. Actually, let's make can view the first one here. We'll say can view, and under that's going to be the input. The type here is going to be radio. The value here is going to be the string edit. Okay, so we'll say value edit, and actually let's just do a lowercase e. Under that, we're going to have a checked property. We're going to need to actually calculate that and add a state variable to this component in a minute. So we'll just leave that for now. On change is going to be the same thing. We're going to need to add a state variable and add the logic to the on change prop. And that is actually it. So let's just close that tag. And that should be what our radio inputs look like. So I'm just going to copy this thing now and paste it down below again. And this one's going to be can edit. Okay, so we'll say can edit. Oh, and this value here should actually be view. I was just kind of on autopilot there. That should be value view, and this edit one should be value equals edit. Cool, so now let's add a state variable that will keep track of which one of those radio buttons is selected, right? We need to add state variables to our React components for radio buttons, just like we need to add them for text inputs. So under here, what we're going to do, we're going to say const selected permission, and set selected permission. And the default value for this one is going to be one of the valid permissions. We're going to set the default value to view. So we'll say equals use state and the string view. Now, we might want to actually make a constant for these strings here just to make sure we don't commit some kind of typo or something like that. So, I mean, for now, I'm just going to say const edit equals edit, and const view equals view. And then we can just replace these things just to be extra safe. So we'll say view, and then we'll go down here. The value here is going to be view, and the value in edit is going to be edit. Okay. Just to make sure that that string stays the same across all of the logic in our component here. So we have our selected permission now, which means that we can add our logic to checked and on change. So checked here is going to depend on whether or not the selected permission is equal to view. And on change, what we're going to do is say set selected permission to whatever the value is here. So we're going to say set that to view. All right, and for edit, we're going to do the same thing, but with edit. So for checked, we're going to say selected permission equals edit. And for on change, we're going to say set selected permission to edit. All right, so that should hopefully all work if I did that right. So let's give this thing a try. We're going to go back to our application here, and it doesn't look super good, but it should at least work. If we click on one of these things, we'll see can view, can edit, right? It switches between them. And it looks a little bit confusing because the radio button is actually after the option, which is not what we want. So let's go back to here, and we're actually going to just move the text down below the input. There we go, and there we go. And that makes it a little easier to read, in my opinion. Now, we can always put these things on their own line by just adding a div around each label. Okay, so if we, oops, let's try that again. If we take the label and put it inside a div, and same thing for this one, we're going to say div, put a label inside of it. That will put each of those radio items on its own line, which can be a little bit easier to read. So that's just the way that I'm going to leave it. And now that we have these radio buttons here, what we're going to need to do is allow the front end to send the selected radio button option along with the request to the server. So what that's going to look like is when this thing is submitted here, all right, when the user clicks this share button, we're going to need to change this a little bit. And instead of just calling onAdd, which if you'll recall is a prop that's being passed in from the parent component, right? Instead of just calling onAdd with the email, we're going to have to add another property to this. So we'll say email, new email, and the other property is going to be role, and that's going to be the selected permission. All right, so now let's go up to our note sharing settings page, which is the one that's displaying this shared emails component. And inside onAdd, instead of just getting the email, what we're going to have to do here is we're going to have to also get the role. And we're going to have to include that when we say share note. So we're going to have to say share note, note ID, email, and role. And remember, this shared note is something that we're getting from our note context here. There are a few layers here that we have to change in case you haven't noticed. So let's go up into our notes provider. And we're going to find shared notes, and basically all we need to do is make sure that we take that extra argument into account and include it with the network request that we're making here. So this should be role. And we're just going to include that alongside email in the request body. Cool, so now all we have to do is go into the back end and take this extra piece of data that we're sending along from our front end into account. So let's go to our share note route. And up here where we're getting the email from the body, we're going to say email, and we're also going to get the role. And we're going to insert that role down here. So instead of saying role view, we're just going to say role. And that should be about it. So everything should work now just like it was working before. So let's actually try adding edit permissions for a user to this note. Let's give John edit permissions to this note. So we're going to say john@gmail.com. We're going to select can edit, and let's click on share. And we see that john@gmail.com is now displayed. Now, one thing that we might want to do here is actually display somewhere in this, in this list item, what kind of permissions this person has. So in order to do that, it's pretty easy. The data is already there. Let's just open up our shared emails component. And we're going to actually need to change this component so that instead of taking emails, it actually takes the sharing settings. So we're going to change this to sharing settings, and we're going to have to change this to sharing settings.map. And each setting is going to have an email property, of course, but it's also going to have the role property, which we're going to want to display. And in order to display that, right after the email, we're going to have a paragraph tag here that will say role. All right, and that's just going to be edit or view for now. Cool, so let's just make sure there's no other emails here that we need to change. No, it looks like we're all good. So we just need to go back up into the note sharing settings page and change the name of that prop that we're passing into our shared emails. So this is going to be sharing settings. And for this, we're just going to pass in note.sharedWith, and we can delete everything else. Okay, but, actually, we will want to add a backup property here, so we'll just add an empty array to that. Cool, so let's see if that worked. What we're going to do is go back here, and sure enough, we see john@gmail.com. We see that John has edit permissions. If we add someone else, like let's add jim@gmail.com, and click share, we see that that gives Jim view permissions instead of edit permissions. And that's how we add that sort of functionality to the front end. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.